Hello, and let's continue our series on the obligations of a consent manager while we are talking about the draft rules available for DPDP Act 2023. Welcome to my YouTube channel where you daily see new content on data privacy, and as I said, we are going to see what are the obligations of a consent manager towards the principal, that is the person whose data is collected, and towards the fiduciary, that is the organization on behalf of which the data is being collected and processed. Prior to that, we'll quickly touch base about the new obligations that have come in, or obligations that have been modified under the DPDP rules as compared to the Act. So we started with issuing notices to data principals. Then we are talking these days about the consent manager. We have already spoken on two things. One is that a consent manager organization is to be registered under Data Protection Board, and consent management job is to outsource to such organizations. What are the criteria of registration and what are the statutory compliances that the consent manager organization has to follow has also been discussed yesterday, and today we are going to talk about his obligations towards the data principal as well as the data fiduciary. In subsequent videos, we are going to talk about how would be data handled for the state beneficiaries, reasonable security safeguards defined under the Act and the rules, intimation of personal breach, and timelines of intimation of that breach have also been defined. So we are going to talk about that as well. And finally, we are going to talk about the verifiable consent that has been now spoken about the privacy of children's data. So let's continue with the consent manager, the person, the organization who is responsible for taking consent from a data principal that we are going to process your data like this. DPDP Act says if you are collecting, storing, processing, disclosing to third parties or deleting personal data of any Indian citizen, then you are liable to be compliant with DPDP Act, right? So the word processing is not restricted only to processing, it also includes collecting, using or processing, storing, deleting or sharing with third parties. So it's a consent manager's job to help explain the purpose of the data that they are collecting and take an informed and specific consent. Some people can argue that the purpose definition is not of consent manager, but then he has to rely on the fiduciary, because until the principal is clear about the consent or the purpose, the sake of getting consent may not help, right? You have a dissatisfied data principal. He also has to make a provision such that people can withdraw the consent, and we'll get into the details of what provisions he has to make in the subsequent slides. So he needs to help data principals understand the purpose of the processing and provide granular options with each data item being collected as to what service is that item going to be mapped with. General consent procedure is to have a platform, an application which would provide a web page sort of a thing where he can collect consent. So the principal can register himself, or you provide a link to the principal to register. There you have the purpose definition, there you have the information. He provides the information, tick marks on the consent against the respective information and submits. That means you have got the consent for those particular services and those particular records. He has to maintain a record of the consents that principals have given, the cases where principals have denied a consent, if any, and the cases where principals have later on withdrawn the consent. He has to keep a record of the notices that were issued to those principals, either prior to processing or prior to even taking or collecting the personal data, right? So the consent is to be either when you collect the personal data, or when you make any changes to the processes, or you introduce new processes, right? So you need to explain the purpose. And any record of sharing of personal data with respective fiduciary. He is transferring the data to the fiduciary after collecting the data with the consent. His job is to manage records of the consent, right? So the transfer to the data fiduciary in a readable format so that the data fiduciary can read it. However, the transfer part of it would be in a non-readable format, encrypted or anonymized or pseudonymized, so that it cannot be hacked and used. For data principals, his obligation is to provide a platform which the principals can access. They can use their data rights over there, so they have a provision that they read their information in a readable format with their respective logins and request any changes, deletions, erasers, withdraw consent, and any other rights that the Act provides. You can get a video on the data principal rights under DPDP Act on my channel. The platform is independent. It is to be on the consent manager's side. He might be working for different fiduciaries, so he needs to be very, very careful on that. But he has to allow access to the data principals for a platform where they can access the services that they have taken from a given consent manager. Right? So consent manager database of principals could be huge, but a principal logs in on two kinds of modes. One where they can see their data and access their rights. Second, on another mode where they can see what services that have they taken from the respective consent manager. That means consent manager indirectly is also letting you know which all fiduciaries have your data and have processed your data, right? Now from the word platform, what we mean is either they have to provide a website or an application. They can choose if they want to provide both, but they have to provide either of those. And then from the general obligations of a consent manager, the consent manager has to own up the entire job as if he is himself as data fiduciary. He has to act as data fiduciary and not just a consent manager. He shall take responsible safety measures, security encryptions, anonymizations, redundancy. We have been talking about CIA, triad, confidentiality, integrity and availability, because he is keeping the personal data and transferring it to the fiduciaries, and he is keeping a record of the personal data. He therefore is also not allowed to subcontract his obligations, no conflict of interest with data fiduciaries, have himself been following effective audit mechanism. We talked about this in our video yesterday also, and he should be answerable to the board on any consent related matters, right? So it's a consent manager who has to act as a fiduciary, take proper consent, explain the proper purpose, and ensure that the data principal can use their rights as and when they want to. So that's about the role of that all makes him accountable and responsible for his activities. That's about the role of a consent manager with respect to the obligations to fiduciaries and principals. I hope you like the content of the video. Please press the bell and the like icon. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have already not done that. We are getting into the details of the rules that have been provisioned. And if you have a feedback, share them in the comment section. Thank you.